everybody, especially Professor Andrea Poma and Jeffrey Barash. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us at this international virtual colloquium on Neo-Kantianism. We are very honored by your presence, even if it's a virtual presence. Your fame here precedes you in Brazil. After all, you are among the main references in Neo-Kantianism studies, and your works are part of any respectable bibliography in a research project. So today, we have the precious opportunity for a direct dialogue with authors who have been our references for a long time. As we have already said in other sessions, this initiative is part of a joint effort to renew and broaden the reception of Neo-Kantianism thought in Brazil, which on this occasion involves 4 Brazilian universities and 2 research groups. For the session, we have also the presence of Professors José Rezende, Fábio Abreu, and Evandro Brito. Sorry. We will start today with Professor Jeffrey Barash's lecture, and then we'll have Professor Poma's lecture. At the end of both talks, we will open up for questions among those present here in the virtual room and then in the audience. Now, I'll give a brief introduction of Professor Jeffrey Barash. He's Emeritus Professor of Philosophy in the University of Picardie. He's Alumnus Fellow of the Society of Fellows in Humanities of the Columbia University. Also, Alumnus Fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Also, in Jean Monnet Fellow for the European University Institute in Florence, Ernest Cassirer Visiting Professor in Hamburg in 2002, Lady Davis Fellow in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Gadamer Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Boston College, Max Planck Fellow in the University of Constance, member of the School of Historical Studies in the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. He is also author, among other works, of Martin Heidegger and the Problem of Historical Meaning, Heidegger et son siècle, which has a Portuguese translation, Heidegger e o seu século, tempo do ser e tempo da história. Also, the symbolic construction of reality, the legacy of Ernest Cassirer, politique de l'histoire, l'historicisme comme promesse et comme mythe, collective memory and historical past, among other works. Today, Professor Barash will give us the lecture, the history between science and art, Wilhelm Windelband and the dilemma of Neo-Kantian theory of history. Professor Barash, you're very welcome. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Since my paper has already been published in Portuguese in your journal, it looks wonderful, and I thank you for including it. I thought that it would be more interesting perhaps if I approached the same subject from a different angle and tried to illustrate how Wilhelm Windelband's conception of history emerged in relation to Schopenhauer, both in a very ambiguous relation to Schopenhauer, both as an appropriation of some of Schopenhauer's fundamental concepts, but also a rejection of his critical attitude toward history. You probably know that Schopenhauer has different sections on history. In the first part of the world as will and representation, but the most famous part that I will talk about today is in the second part, chapter 38, which is simply titled On History, über Geschichte. This chapter had an enormous impact. This chapter, but all of the world as will and representation in Schopenhauer's other writings had a tremendous impact, as is well known, on Germany and on Europe at the end of the 19th century. I'll just give you two examples beside Windelband, who is a very attentive reader of Schopenhauer, and he commented on him a number of times in his writings. The first example is Jakob Burckhardt, the great contemporary of Windelband, who lived in Basel. And many of Burckhardt's attitudes toward philosophy and culture in the late 19th century are expressed in his correspondence, especially his letters to von Prehn. And in 1870, the very period of the war between Prussia and France, Burckhardt wrote to von Prehn about Schopenhauer. He says, I quote him, the change in the German spirit will be so great as that of the French spirit. He says, and he continues a few sentences later, also the worth of the philosopher. And when he talks, Burckhardt talks about the philosopher, he means Schopenhauer. The worth, the value of the philosopher is going up very steadily, while Hegel at the same time is going down. And in fact, it is time for Hegel to definitively go into retreat, into his retirement. So you have an idea of the Schopenhauer, of Burckhardt, who is very much influenced by Schopenhauer in many ways, especially what's called Schopenhauer's pessimism, even if he was very reserved about certain of Schopenhauer's judgments about history. Another example, there are many I could give, but the other example, which is probably the most famous, is of course Burckhardt's contemporary and friend, Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. You'll remember that Nietzsche wrote the first of the untimely meditations, the one before History, where he adopts many of Schopenhauer's critiques of historical knowledge and historiography. The third, of the untimely meditations after the essay on history is called Schopenhauer as Educator. So there's a whole essay on Schopenhauer, and you can just see the importance of Schopenhauer on the young Nietzsche's thought. I cite a short passage from Schopenhauer's Educator, where he writes, "It was thus truly roving through wishes to imagine I might discover a true philosopher as an educator who could raise me above my insufficiencies insofar as these originated in the age, and teach me again to be simple and honest in thought and life, that is to say, to be untimely." That word understood in the profoundest sense. So we looked to Schopenhauer for a spirit of untimeliness, a very important point in Nietzsche's vocabulary. I could go on about the influence that Schopenhauer had more implicit on historians like Droysen and others, but let me turn to Schopenhauer's attitude toward history. Just a few comments about it before pointing out the ambiguity of Windelband toward Schopenhauer's thought, and which will highlight the problem of the relation between art and history, which comes out very clearly in this ambivalence between them, and therefore connects with the main topic of my paper. I wanted to underline two aspects of Schopenhauer's thoughts on history that come out in chapter 38 of book 2, two aspects that would seem to be contradictory. This has often been said. For one example, among Schopenhauer's contemporaries, Kuno Fischer, the great Neo-Kantian historian of philosophy, Kuno Fischer, who thought that the two sides of Schopenhauer's argument were completely contradictory, and which I think is very interesting. I think that they're not. I mean, I think that there's one word at the end of the essay that Schopenhauer says that shows you how they can be reconciled, and I will end my short comments on Schopenhauer with that. So the first side of this ambiguity, or this, I must say, antinomy in Schopenhauer's relationship or his attitude toward history, can be seen in his critique of historical knowledge, of historiography of his period. You'll see that in the very first sentence, or first paragraph of his essay on history, he cites Aristotle. And he cites Aristotle's famous judgment about history in the Poetics, where Aristotle wrote that poetry is more philosophical and higher than history, for poetry tends to express the universal, history the particular. And Schopenhauer says that his comments on history are going to elaborate on this negative judgment of Aristotle, who placed poetics and art more generally higher than historical knowledge. And he says that this is simply because history, historical events, historical facts are infinite. They're completely individual. They are, in their reality, in their objective reality, they're completely ungraspable. Nobody can really understand what history is in its objective reality. And so that attempts to do this are simply fictive constructions. And this is where Schopenhauer draws an analogy between historical knowledge and art, precisely because art too is concerned with individuality, but it approaches individuality through the aesthetic idea, raising it to a higher level, whereas history simply creeps along the ground, as Schopenhauer says, in restricting itself to individual events, which always change, which are completely contingent, which never repeat themselves, and therefore cannot be made into a science, which requires generalizations and systems in order to predict the future on the basis of the past, like the generalizing laws of physics or other natural sciences. History is unable to do this, and therefore, very much like Kant, he believed that there was little value in talking about history as a science. It goes beyond Kant in his radicalism. I cite a brief sentence of Schopenhauer, page 439, 440, in the second volume of the Dover edition, translation of The World as a Will and Representation, where Schopenhauer writes, "History lacks the fundamental characteristics of science, for nowhere does it know the particular by means of the universal, but it must comprehend the particular directly and continue to creep along the ground of experience," so to speak. So he denied that history had any scientific status, that historical knowledge concerned some objective reality beyond the human knower. And this is why he was able to say one page later in his chapter on history, I quote him, "History is therefore the more interesting, the more special it is, but also the less trustworthy, and thus it approximates in all respects to a work of fiction." We see that for Schopenhauer, because there's no grounding in objective reality, given the infinite individuality of historical facts and events, therefore the constructs of the historian are simply fictive. So I think that this is a very important point. Also, the point that for him, human nature, the human essence, as he called it, das menschliche Wesen, is everywhere the same. What changes is the outer appearances, but ultimately, the inner motives and the inner springs of action don't change over time. They are the same, and so it's not necessary. The historical knowledge of the claims to be grounded in objective fact, in fact, is not necessary to know the human essence. And art has a better access to it because it raises it to the universal and to the idea, as he calls it, which history cannot do in the same way. On this basis, of course, he criticizes Hegel. I mean, Hegel was his great enemy. It's known that they held their classes at the same time at the University of Berlin. Hegel was the great philosopher with tremendous audiences. Schopenhauer had 6 or 7 students at each lecture, and at the time he was not at all appreciated. And he had great resentment against Hegel for many reasons, but he also, on intellectual grounds, thought that his philosophy of history, as he called it, was a mythology. It's a mythological construction, as he says. So I think that this is a very important, this is the first part of the essay. And so now I turn to the second part of the essay. The second part of the essay, in which he seems to contradict what he says, because he says that history does have a value. And the value of history is precisely in that nations can know and remember their own past. And if they don't know their own past, they have a lack of self-consciousness, as he calls it. I quote him on page 445, where he talks about der Wert der Geschichte, the value of history, where he says that only through history does a nation become completely conscious of itself. Accordingly, history is to be regarded as rational self-consciousness of the human race. It is to the race what the reflected and connected consciousness, conditioned by the faculty of reason, is to the individual. So this is a very odd way, after debunking and criticizing the objectivity and the reality of any knowledge of the historical past, he then, in the second part, talks about the value of a nation knowing its own past and how this is central to its self-awareness, its self-consciousness. But I think that if you look closely at the concluding argument that he presents, you can see that he actually resolves the paradox, because at one point he says the true value of history, the universal and predominant interest, rests mainly on its being a personal concern of the human race. Eine persönliche Angelegenheit. It's a personal concern of the human race. I think this idea that, therefore, it doesn't have to be grounded in any kind of objective being or reality. It doesn't have to have any claim to having objective worth and having some reality in an ongoing existence of the past. What's important is that it's the subjective value, the personal concern for the past has a value for the will, for individual self-knowledge in general. So that it's a paradoxical idea that comes out in Schopenhauer, but I think it's not entirely contradictory. What is clear is that given its individuality and its infinite individuality, events and facts have no ground in objective being, and therefore no claim to scientific reality, scientific status. So let's turn to Windelband and Windelband's appropriation of Schopenhauer. It's really very interesting, his attitude towards Schopenhauer. He cites him at numerous places in his works, namely in his famous rectoral address presented at the University of Strasbourg, which is called History and Natural Science, where he justifies and attempts to ground the theory of history, historical knowledge, as scientific knowledge against Schopenhauer, while appropriating and accepting Schopenhauer's judgment that history ultimately has to do with an infinite manifold of facts, of individual singular facts. This is a very central point. And he goes so far in this rectoral address presented in Strasbourg, which is in the first volume of Preludian, as I mentioned in my paper. He goes so far as to agreeing not only with Schopenhauer's qualification of history as dealing with individual facts, which are infinite in their variety and singularity, but for that very reason, he reaffirms Schopenhauer's claim that history is like art, that like art, history has to do with individuality. And nonetheless, in spite of these two elements of Schopenhauer's theory of history that Windelband acknowledges and accepts, nonetheless, in the rectoral address, History and Natural Science, Schopenhauer explicitly names Schopenhauer, he explicitly mentions Schopenhauer, and says that although he's right in claiming that history deals with individual singular events and facts, it is not for that reason unscientific. It can be systematized and made into a science. So it's this idea of science, history as a science, that I analyze in some detail in my paper, and its departure from Kantian criticism, critical theory. A few words could be said about that. In other words, the question I ask is, well, what makes it possible to systematize history as a science? And the reason is, for Windelband, is that like natural science, history deals with concepts. It's not simply an attempt to systematize an infinity of individual facts for their own sake. And not all facts have the same status. It's not because they're individual that all facts. The example he gives is Goethe. He says, well, one day Goethe may have dropped a letter into the letterbox, and we have a record of it that he talks about it in one of his discussions with Eckermann. I was walking down the street and I dropped a letter in the letterbox. This had absolutely no historical interest at all. So it's a singular event for sure. And there are an infinite number of individual events, but most of these events have absolutely no historical interest. So the question is, what is it that makes historical fact, a singular historical fact, interesting and of concern to the historian? And what makes it possible to claim not only that it's of an interest, and therefore a persönliche Angelegenheit, a personal concern, but is anchored in an objective reality? The answer that Windelband gives, the famous answer that I deal with in my paper, is it's precisely because history deals, the concept formation of history is on the basis of values, of singular values. It's because the historian values something in the past, that singular values that the historian is able to choose among an infinite manifold of facts, those facts in the past which are relevant and that have a true meaning. And he goes so far as to say, yes, and this is not only, this is a true meaning also, not simply, it doesn't restrict history to the status of an art, but it raises it to the level of a science precisely because these values are grounded in an overarching historical continuity, an overarching historical tradition. He writes an essay on tradition in the Preludian, And it's this continuity, this tradition, this cohesion, Zusammenhang, of the different values over time, their development and their the way in which they progress. He uses the idea of progress because the different mistakes, even in natural science, they correct themselves over time, and the pursuit of truth becomes ever more refined over the course of history. And this is because the values are not simply subjective whims that change arbitrarily over time, but because they are anchored in a larger cohesion, an objective cohesion that guides or that overreaches, overgirds the historical process as a whole. And so we see that this tends toward a kind of a teleological, he doesn't like the word metaphysics and he rejects it, but he accepts the Kantian vision of a teleological unity of the historical process. It's teleological in the sense that you can't see it in operating in empirical reality itself, but it's something that you can ideally presuppose. It's legitimate to ideally presuppose. It's this cohesion over time. It's this ability to presuppose that the values that I apply in lending meaning to the facts of the past in their individuality and choosing among those facts, those that are meaningful as opposed to those that are not, which makes it possible to claim that history has a real and objective meaning. There's much to be said about this, but I would like simply to underline one aspect of this, the aspect that is so sharply criticized in the period after the First World War. I deal with this at some length in my book, Martin Heidegger and the Problem of Historical Meaning, where the first part of the book deals with the development, the emergence of a problem of historical meaning after Hegel, and precisely in this Neo-Kantian context, the context of the Neo-Kantians in Dilthey, how it is that the problem of historical meaning emerges in this period. The way in which Windelband was very aware of this. He's constantly criticizing the idea of what he calls relativism or historism or historicism, historismus, which is in the Preludium. There are many points at which he says, it's precisely our idea of transcendent values that overgird the historical process as a whole, that makes it possible for us to escape from relativism, from historicism, which would claim that the values are radically changing and that there is therefore no theoretical cohesion, no theoretical continuity, and no value to tradition itself. And so Windelband goes so far, and Rickert after him, his student and disciple and the philosopher who really systematized this idea of historical science beyond Windelband in the period before the First World War. The word that he uses is the idea of transcendence. There are transcendent values. So you see that he's going beyond Kant toward a clear Platonism. And he writes an essay on Plato, by the way, in the Preludium. It's not an accident that Plato, he goes back to the Kantian roots, the Platonic roots of Kant. And you remember that when Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, where in the beginning of the Transcendental Dialectic, where the first passage is on the ideas, and he defines what the ideas are, he says that he wants not to give a metaphysical status to ideas, but nonetheless he wants to give them a value that has been denied by modern philosophy as a whole. He wants to renew a certain tendency of the Platonic philosophy. He says this explicitly, although in a critical perspective, without the heavy metaphysical basis. And so Windelband is very much faithful to Kant in this way. After breaking with Kant's refusal to acknowledge history as a science, the possibility of making history into a science in the same way as the natural sciences, nonetheless, he's willing to acknowledge the Platonic, goes even beyond Kant, I think, in saying that it's because there are these transcendent values beyond the empirical field that can't be ascertained in empirical history itself, but which can be ideally presupposed by the historian as the ultimate basis of historical science. I point out in my book on Heidegger that in Heidegger's early lectures in the 1920s, I think, for example, of his introduction to the phenomenology of religion, where there are long passages on Windelband and on Rickert in which he points out this Platonism, this Platonic element in their philosophy, which he says we have to deconstruct. This is the part of philosophy that we can no longer acknowledge, which is a very important critique and shows a kind of a watershed after the First World War, where this idea of an overarching cohesion of the historical process no longer seems plausible to most philosophers, and Heidegger's critique being the most radical expression of it. I have spoken already for nearly 40 minutes. I will simply conclude with the conclusion of my paper itself, because I think that that Windelband is very important, and I think the relation between Schopenhauer and Windelband is also very important, precisely because of this idea. This idea that, one second. Oui, je suis dans la conférence. Je suis dans la conférence. Okay, ciao. Was my wife. And so I think that the ultimate problem is the problem of this assumption that historical reality is this nominalistic assumption shared by Schopenhauer and Windelband, that empirical reality is ultimately completely individual and completely unfathomable. That this reality is completely, is not something that we have any meaningful relationship with. And I think that the way I end my paper is, I think the really important reason for dealing with Windelband's thought, with Neo-Kantianism generally, is precisely because of this assumption and because of the way in which Dilthey, I think Dilthey for me is a great source of inspiration. Dilthey's great essay on our conviction on the reality of an external world, the famous essay in which he goes against precisely this Neo-Kantian assumption of his times. It's an essay that Heidegger would praise and that he would refer to, and that had a great importance throughout the 1920s and 30s. If you look at Helmut Plessner, for example, his philosophical anthropology, it takes off from this idea of Dilthey. This idea, which I myself find extremely important, is the idea that, in fact, there is a reality to the historical past. It's a reality that comes to expression in the latency, the ongoing meaningfulness, and the latency of symbols, of the symbolic embodiment of experience as memory, which I deal with in my book, Collective Memory in the Historical Past. And this, I think that Dilthey gives some very, very good indication, because what he says in this essay, and I think this is why it's important, unfortunately, it's extremely brief. There are only 2 pages on it. But what he says is extremely important, because when he talks about the outer world, the Außenwelt, what he's talking about is not simply external objects that we touch. It's not physical objects, but it's also the historical past. This external reality is a reality that persists, that continues to live in us, even if in only latent form, many times in latent form, through, and I would say through language, through symbols. I think that we can integrate this also into Cassir's wonderful idea of symbolic pregnance, symbolische Prägnanz, which I think is one of the great insights, in which you can, Basisphänomena, symbolic pregnance, where it's precisely this insight of a reality that is not simply an individuality that has no sense in its own terms, but the idea of symbolic incarnations of experience that continue to live in us and that continue to be points of orientation for the present, even beyond what we know in awareness. And so the role of the historian becomes extremely important. The role of the historian has to do with making explicit precisely those symbolic embodiments that are implicit and that we don't know. And the proof of this is the way I end my paper, and I will end my talk on this note. The proof of this is precisely that in our confrontation with the past, what we can confront is precisely something, not simply a continuity in Windelband's sense, but also a radical alterity, a radical difference between the past and the present, a radical difference that makes it, in many cases, very difficult to know the past, but nonetheless that can persist, that can continue beyond our explicit knowledge of it, and that can, when we begin to think about it, becomes very bothersome. Dilthey already saw this. It can bother. It can reaffirm and can lead us, encourage us in our present action, but it can also be a source of great bother. And so I think that it's extremely important to bring out this latency of symbolic embodiments of the past. And this is where my work on collective memory begins. So I would like to thank you very much for your invitation. I hope that my talk was clear to you. And it was a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you and before you.
Thank you very much, Professor Barash. It was very nice to hear you today. And so I'm going to give a brief presentation of Professor Poma. Yes, here. So Professor Andrea Poma was assistant professor at the University of Turin, then associate professor of philosophy of religion at the University of Macerata, of philosophy of history at the University of Rome, and of moral philosophy at the University of Turin. He was also chairman of the Department of Philosophical Hermeneutics at the University of Turin and member of the Società Italiana di Studi Kantiani, of the Hermann Cohen Gesellschaft and Hermann Cohen Academy, of Phronesis, Associazione Italiana per la Consulenza Filosofica, and other associations. Professor Poma is author, among other works, of The Critical Philosophy of Hermann Cohen, Yearning for Form, and other essays on Hermann Cohen's thought, and The Impossibility and Necessity of Theodicy, the essays of Leibniz. So today, Professor Poma will give us the lecture Monotheism and Philosophy, Brief Reflection from a Lecture by Hermann Cohen. Professor Poma, you're very welcome, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes, very well.
So I don't will read all the text of my paper because it is published in the review. I would only stay on some points from Cohen thought that are, in my opinion, very important also for our today situation in the postmodernism. In 1914, I wrote a book, Cadenzas, about where I proposed a philosophical program for the postmodernity, alternative to the program of the French philosophers as Deleuze, Foucault, Guattari, and others. I said this was a Dionysian thought, and I proposed an alternative, radical alternative program as a lyric thought. And I find that some points in Cohen thought are very important also for this perspective, and they were for me fundamental for developing of my reflections. So in my paper, I started from a surprising sentence of Cohen in a lecture of 1907. I quote, in recent times, however, an aversion to religion has increased in cultural formation circles due to distrust and lack of modesty towards philosophy. So that is surprising because it's very different from the traditional point of view of a conflict between religion and philosophy. On the contrary, Cohen says that the crisis of religion depends from a crisis of philosophy. What he means? He means that religion and faith also needed of philosophy for her theological doctrines, and on the other hand, philosophy and sciences too needed of the idea of God for the foundation of their cultural system. He says, I quote, "Since, as in all religious moments, not least for us, the real and very difficult of our religious situation lies about the difference in the cultural conception of the world, and there should be no doubt for any man of culture that only philosophy is able to give a different view of the world because it is capable of founding it." But on the other hand, it says also that the philosophy and the sciences that refuse the idea of God, they have no more a foundation of their thinking and of their research. So what is this religious foundation? This religious foundation is the idea of God. The idea of God is the idea of uniqueness of God. This is the point of the monotheism, of the Jewish monotheism for Cohen, but in general of the monotheism. The uniqueness of God is the foundation of the possibility of ethics. it is not the foundation of ethics, but the foundation of the possibility of ethics. Also, in Cohen, there is no reduction of the faith to the ethics, or of the religion to the ethics. There is no. The idea of God is no an ethics principle. In the Ethic des reinen Willens, the idea of God has no the goal to found the ethics. It appears only at the end of the argumentation as a guarantee of the unity in infinity, of the unity between to be and the how to be. As it's the same in Kant. In the critical practical reason, the idea of God has no space in the foundation of the ethics, only as guarantee for the summum bonum, from the highest good. So this is an important question that philosophy and monotheistic religion have together. The difference between to be and the ought to be. This difference must be maintained. The principal error of the absolute idealism of Schelling and Hegel, and also of Fichte in a part of his philosophy, is to unify, to identify to be and ought to be. The difference, the ontological, the critical difference between to be and ought to be is for Cohen a fundamental principle. Cohen in the Ethic des reinen Willens speaks first about this difference. Ought to be is different from to be, and remains different from to be. Second, that doesn't signify that to ought to be is not. So Cohen speak about the be of the ought to be, because ought to be is at the same ontological level as to be. And these two points together, the difference and the same plane, are very important for Cohen thought. I tried to develop this idea in a third moment that is not explicitly expressed by Cohen, but in fact is in his thought. Ought to be is different to be from to be, but ought to be is only in to be, in interior of to be. That we cannot find in Cohen as explicit theory, but in fact is the sense of his idea, of his theme of the humor. The humor is actually this reality of the ought to be in the be, in the factual reality. This is very important because this is the principle of the critic. The critic is the ought to be that live in the being, and living in the being criticize the being any day, any hour, ever. This is the first point. The second point is that Cohen make a confrontation between religion and also the Jewish tradition and philosophy, that is the Greek tradition. He says the Greek tradition made the philosophy and the sciences, and the Jewish tradition had no science. The science and the philosophy in the Jewish tradition is an importation from the Greek tradition, because the faith, the religious thought, is another way as the philosophical or scientific way. But these two different ways as one element, one common element. They are two ways of the universal reason. The religion, as the philosophy and the science, is a way of the universal reason. And so we come to the second point, the messianism. Messianism is the second postulate, right, Cohen, the second high point of his lesson. Messianism is a messianism without a messias, says someone. It is, in Cohen it is so. Messianism is an idea, is not a person, is an idea. The idea of the universal humanity. God is not God of a people, is not God of a state, is God of the humanity. And Jewish people has a goal to testify in the general, in the universal culture, this universality of the idea of God. There is a point very, very interesting where Cohen says, I quote, "The only God cannot be the God of a state. He can only be the God of men gathered in morality. This one God is what we must bring to true recognition in the world. That is our task in world history. If we didn't have that mission, or didn't have it anymore, then retaining our lineage would no longer have any Hebrew meaning." Well, he says, you understand? He says, we, the Jews, when we don't have more this, don't have longer this mission to testify the universal sense of the unique God, our existence had no more Hebrew sense. This is very interesting. Also, this idea of the universal humanity is the principal idea of the humanism. And humanism is another character of Cohen thought, and it is another character about what we difference the different philosophical proposal in postmodernity, because the Dionysiac thought, Deleuze, Foucault, and the others, they are philosophers of a radical anti-humanistic thought that come from Nietzsche, from Schopenhauer, from Nietzsche, from structuralism, from Freud, and so other. I think at a lyric thought as a radical rationalistic and humanistic proposal for the postmodernity. And this humanism has his inspiration in this concept of Cohen, the messianism of as the idea of the universal humanity, and humanity is not a biological definition or an existential definition. Humanity is not a substantive, it is an attribute. Human and no human. That is the theme, not what is the man. We don't know what is the man. We will work. We work to become the man. The man is who can realize ever more the humanity, the humanness, human life, and they oppose to the unhuman, anti-human life. This is a very important point in my opinion of inspiration from Cohen thought. Third point is the difference between sacred and saint, because all the Cohen interpretation of the Jewish tradition is in the sense of the ethics action, of the ethic realization of the good, ethic and politics and artistic also and so on. But saint is not the same as sacred. In English, also in German, there is the same word for saint and sacred. But this is very ambiguous, because the saint is the opposite of the sacred. The monotheism is the history, the 2 millennial history of the battle against the sacred. Against the sacred. All the development of the interpretation of the sacrifice is a desacralization of the sacrifice. When in Bereshit is wrote, he made the sun and the moon as 2 lamps in the sky. Also, the sun and the moon were God in the other cultures where the Hebrew were living. And the author of Bereshit said they are only lamp, only light, artificial light. So that is a desacralization, and we can make more and more examples. Sacred and saint are completely different way to think and to feel and to live, because also in the conception and the living the time in the theology of the later decades of the 20th century, there was a very general doctrine about the difference between the mythos time and the Christian time. Mythos time is a circle, and Christian or monotheistic time is a line. But it's false. In my opinion, it's false, because the time for the sacred is a circle, yes, but the circle is only the model of the nature time. The nature time is the circle. But what is important for the sacred, sacred conception of time is not the circle, but the break in the circle. it is a circle, but there is a break in this circle. This moment at the end of the year and before the beginning of the new year. There's a break in the circle. This is the important for the sacred, because the sacred is the conception of the existence with the categories of pure, impure. And pure, impure are not contrary. Pure, impure are not contrary, not opposite. What is pure is also impure. We can make many examples. So the pure, impure cannot be pardoned, must be washed, must be purified. And purification is this zero of existence, this break into the circle of the time. In this break, they made or make a fast, a great fast. All the rules are suspended. All the differences between man and woman, between rich and poor, and so all are suspended. All is chaos, and then begins a new order, and all the individuals begin a new order, and they begin a new purity. This is the only way for the sacred. But the saint is another conception. The saint is under the category of good and evil, is the ethics. And the time of the saint is not a linear, is not a circular, is not a linear, is an expansive, is a plane with many infinite directions, possibilities, choices. And this is the time and the space of the ethics of the saint. And you can and you must also decide between good and evil. I learn to you what is good and evil, said the God. So the difference is that good, when enter in the contact with the evil, can save the evil. On the contrary, in the sacred perspective, when the pure enter in contact with the impure, is the impure that transforms the pure. So the saint is the space and the time of the ethics, and in this space and this time, the humor is fundamental, because ethics is the conception that in every moment of your individual or common or social or general or universal life, you can begin a good way. The past is the past, but from every point of your situation, you can be or begin to be virtuous, to be moral, to go in the good direction. This is what is impossible in the sacred conception of the existence. And this is very important also for our postmodern time, because our postmodern time is a new deep sacral culture. And the most important representant of the sacral culture in the Occidental, but also in the Oriental tradition or the Middle Oriental tradition, is the Gnosis. The gnosis is the really the alternative to monotheism, not the atheism, but the gnosis. And the gnosis is the triumph of the sacred. And our postmodern culture and society is a society without God, without the words are not important, but deep sacred, deep sacred. And when we don't understand this, we don't understand the possibilities of the monotheism in this society, the critical possibility of the monotheism in this society. I with my students, I analyze some way the fests in the discotheques and dancing. They are the same as the fest at the beginning of the year in all the sacred cultures. Light, stark light, um, uh, obsessive music, drugs, and then all begins anew. So these points, uniqueness of God, the how to be in the being as a critical point of the being, the humanism, the rationalism, and the humor, of course, and this opposition, critical opposition of the saint, of the ethics against the sacred. These are, for me, very important points in this conference of Cohen, but also in general in Cohen thought. Thank you.
Thank you for Professor Poma for this very interesting talk. So we already have some questions from the audience, but we will begin with José Rezende. Is that right? Please, you have the floor.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
Tá ótimo.
Good afternoon from Brazil. Initially, I would like to thank the invitation to of the Colloquium coordination to participate in this session, and of course, to congratulate Professor Jeffrey Barash and Professor Andrea Poma for their brilliance and provoking lectures. I'd like to ask a question to Professor Barash. My question is simple, but I think it's important for me, intrigues me. My question is about perhaps the types of values and Windelband thought about historical knowledge. Is it possible to say that Windelband's dilemma that you point in your presentation, is it possible to say that Windelband's dilemma regarding the scientificity of historical concepts lies in the incompatibility of trying to coordinate two types of values? What I mean, on the one hand, Windelband talks about the empirical values, which are recognized positively or negatively by human communities from the past, guiding their collective action in order to produce the singularity of cultural goods or cultural phenomena. It would be these values that the historian, as a scientist, should identify in order to produce scientifically consistent historical concepts. On the other hand, to make this composition of historical concepts possible, the Neo-Kantians Windelband and later Rickert, would need to postulate absolute and unhistorical values in order to ensure a cohesion throughout history. In short, my question is it possible to say that Windelband and Rickert work with two types of values, empirical and historical values on the one hand, and absolute and unhistorical values on the other hand? Or we can say that empirical values are just the way that absolute values are realized in cultural goods or phenomena. Is this? I don't know if I could express exactly the idea, but if you can make some comments, I appreciate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for a question. It's a very interesting question. In fact, there are three kinds of values, and I think that this comes out in a very important publication that you may be familiar with. It's a festschrift that was written for Kuno Fischer, and it was published in 1907, and it's called Philosophy in the Beginning of the 20th Century, Die Philosophie im Beginn des 20. Jahrhunderts, and both Windelband and Rickert contributed to it. Rickert wrote a very important essay, which is called The Philosophy of History, Geschichtsphilosophie, and Windelband wrote two essays for it, the last of which is particularly important, in which he explains why the history of philosophy is important and has a legitimate claim to being philosophical and not just historical. It's a very important point. And so I think that the answer to the question is given there. First of all, in talking about values, you talked about empirical. It's important to make a distinction. Windelband makes this distinction, and Rickert has a very important long analysis of the difference between what both of them called practical value judgments and theoretical relation to values. The difference is very simple. In other words, a practical value judgment is when I say, if I talk about Napoleon, and I say, oh, Napoleon was a dictator, and I criticize him and make a value judgment about his heritage. And that has to be distinguished from what they call theoretische Wertbeziehung, a theoretical relation to values, which means that I suspend all value judgments and I simply try to understand what Napoleon's values were, what the values of the period of Napoleon were, and how those values were incorporated into institutions and different political, artistic, and other cultural structures of the period. And so you have this very important distinction. And in fact, it's the theoretische Wertbeziehung, the theoretical relation to values, which makes it possible to talk about an objective relation to the past. Objectivity is based not in theoretische praktische Wertung. It's not value judgments, but rather an ability to stand back and see what values in the past that may be very different from ours, in fact, guided the actions of historical figures in the past. So those are the two important values for empirical investigation in the sciences. On the other hand, as you very correctly say, and this both Rickert and Windelband go into in their contributions to this festschrift for Kuno Fischer, they go into it in other places, but it's particularly clear in these two essays, which is to say that there is an overarching structure of values, which in fact is like the Platonic system, really. You're right in saying that it's not it's something that is unchanging. It's a ultimate idea of justice, for example, is not something that changes. Something that is intrinsically just, intrinsically good, is not something that changes. But the ultimate essence of the good is not something that we have empirical knowledge of, but it exists. We have to presuppose its existence beyond the sphere of our empirical reality. So this is extremely important, and the importance is also the idea that these transcendent values, if they are not, cannot be seen or touched or understood in their empirical manifestations, nonetheless, in the progression of the sciences, in the progression of culture in general, from a metaphysical to a critical way, to a scientific theoretical outlook, such kinds of progression are manifestations of a kind of unifying principle of rationality that that founds all of the different manifestations of theoretical values throughout human history. So that it's Platonic also has a kind of a Neoplatonic idea of emanation that goes back to Plotinus. There's a Fichtean element in it as well. So I think that the question of values is a complex one, but very, very important, very interesting in the way that both of them develop it. Of course, Rickert develops it at great length in his book, Die Grenzen der naturwissenschaftlichen Begriffsbildung, the limits of the formation of concepts in the natural sciences, which is really a classic work. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lucas, what do you say? We keep with Professor Barash, or we turn to Professor Poma to the questions of here, the participants?
Your call, but if you wanted to already put things on that.
Yes. We have a very good question here. So I'll keep it to Professor Barash. I'll read the question, Professor. Thank you very much for the conference. I have a question for Professor Barash. In Windelband's latest book, Introduction to Philosophy, the treatment of the problems of the philosophy of history is framed within a practical philosophy and not only as a discussion of historical knowledge. How would you understand this situation? Does this practical view depend on the notion of ideographic sciences? Would there be ethical presuppositions in the conception of historical knowledge, or would they be independent ways of approaching history? This is a question of our colleague Jacinto Paes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Windelband is very much influenced by Kant, and he adopts the Kantian language and the Kantian distinction between what is and what should be, the famous Sein und Sollen. And precisely this idea of Sollen, what should be, which is this ideal duty or this ideal ethical principle, is something that he totally believed in, and thought that this was the core of the Kantian ethical system that had great bearing on historical knowledge in general. In other words, there is an ethical dimension to historical knowledge. The fact of being faithful to the past, the fact of striving for objective theoretical truth is not simply only a theoretical interest. It also has an ethical dimension to it. He doesn't go into that a great deal, but he definitely says it in the Preludium. There are several points at which he refers to this ethical dimension of historical knowledge.
Thank you very much. So I didn't know. I don't know who's going to be first. Probably first, and then the one. Please.
May I ask a question of Professor Poma?
Yes, of course.
Okay. I was extremely interested in several aspects of your talk, especially the way in which you portray the close connection between philosophy and religion. It's something that is, I think, very difficult in Cohen, but extremely important. And I thought that you presented it very clearly. What really interested me was also what you say about the Messiah, the idea that the Messiah is not a person who's going to, come back, but rather the Messiah has to be thought of as an idea of humanity. It's a really a very interesting, a very, very interesting concept. And are you referring essentially, which writings of Cohen are you referring to especially in talking about that? Are you referring to the religion of reason? Is it in that context? I know that in Deutschtum and Judentum, which he writes in 1915, where he talks about Herder, there's an amazing passage in there where he says that it's Herder. The Jews, in fact, had more or less neglected the Messianic tradition, and it's Herder who reminded them of the importance and revived it also for the Jewish tradition. I thought that was a very interesting point that he makes there in talking about Herder. But also, I'm not familiar with that passage in the Religion of Reason. It probably is there. It's just that I forgot. But is it also does it occur in there? Or is it more in the System of Philosophy? Or the second volume on ethics? Is it more ethics of pure will?
Yeah. So I think you quote one of the most important themes for Cohen in the Jewish tradition is theme of Messianism that comes from Maimonides and the influence from Maimonides to Cohen through many others authors. So I think someone can interpret this idea of Messianism as a secularization, as a demythologization, and I think it's so. It was in the direction of the Wissenschaft des Judentums and of this reform, new reform Jewish direction movement. But I think also that for Cohen it was also personally a mission. He feels that he has the heritage of Ezekiel, of the prophet Ezekiel, because his Hebrew name was Ezekiel, and he feels as a mission for himself to predicate this value of Judaism in the European culture, and this is my opinion. It is the sense of this essay, Deutschtum und Judentum. This is very problematic because it was very poky. Few years there was the Nazism. Also, his perspective about symbiosis between Judaism and Germany seems to be comics, tragic and comics together. But in fact, it was an idea that the German culture, and for Cohen, German culture signify European culture. European culture is the results of two traditions, the Jewish traditions and the Greek traditions. And these two different traditions have a common perspective, the reason, the universal reason. And so Judaism in German culture is a critical memory of this heritage. And this is for Cohen important, tragic, important.
Thank you.
So, Fabio, please.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I thank you, Professor Barash and Professor Andrea, for the wonderful lectures. And also would like to thank all the organizing committee of this round table, because I'm not a Neo-Kantian or a philosopher, so to say. I'm rather a liberal Lutheran theologian, so I'm like a spirit amongst you. So I would have some questions and comments, and regarding all the comprehension of history in Windelband, and also in regards to the philosophy of religion of Cohen. And those questions are really important to me and to my personal research. So starting with Professor Barash, it seems to me that in Windelband's constructions of history, the a priori is not longer derived from a perception and illustrated in its traditional logical constituent, as it is in Kant, but derived from the subject achievements of science, among which the natural sciences, given the common origin of modern philosophy and modern natural sciences from mathematics, are relatively easily accepted by Kant's procedure, while the historical sciences, which have grown in a completely different philosophical climate, at least in the form of the German historical school presupposed by Lotze, Dilthey, and Windelband, are much more difficult to come to a unanimous, a priori, and quite uncritical concepts such as individuality and the structure which is brought up with it. But as soon as one proceeds in this way, with the natural sciences taking into account their constructive unitary concepts, and next to it, the completely different structured history, the whole strictly unitary Kantian concept of the a priori developed from the transcendental deduction begins to falter, it seems to me, in Windelband. It either becomes a series of different hypotheses and form presuppositions, which first have to be justified by their fertility, as is the case with Georg Simmel, for instance, or it requires a phenomenological analysis of the structures of scientific instinct and involuntary vision as its own presupposition, as the Edmund Husserl poses as a preparatory task before any transcendental logic. And even more than the a priori, the phenomenalism of external and above all internal experience, which Kant is inextricably related to, is shaken by all of it, just as it belongs to the indiscussable prerequisites of empirical history that it grasps something of the absolute real in the movement of historical life and in the development of intellectual content. So in Windelband's theory, the Kantian coupling of space and time and the simple phenomenality historical time cannot be maintained. Accordingly, Windelband has expressly given up both and finally answered the question of the possibility of simultaneously existence of human subjective forms of thought and absolute reality in the same act of cognition by referring to the doctrine of identity. In this sense, he even speaks of a metaphysics of the spirit, which underlies every knowledge of historical development. With this, a connection with Leibniz, Schelling, Fichte, and Hegel, and finally with Lotze, is expressed with full consciousness, but also precisely for the sake of history, Kantianism is fundamentally exceeded, and it is only through these decisive dissolutions in detail that the combination of being and value, oder Gegebenen Aufgegebenen, of idea and growth becomes possible, which characterize the transformation of merely cognitive theoretical criticism into content-related cultural philosophy. So my question is, what's the relationship that we can construct between Windelband's philosophical system and the idealist systems advanced by, amongst others, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel? Is Windelband really an outsider when we consider the constellation of problems stemming from German idealism? And the concept of constellation of problems is, of course, derived from Dieter Heinrich. If he's not like an outsider of the constellation of the problems stem from German idealism, what are the difference and approximations between Windelband and the classical German philosophy? So that's my question to Professor Barash.
I think his relation to Hegel is most clear. I mean, he doesn't talk a great deal about Fichte or Schelling, but he does mention Hegel quite a bit. And of course, he doesn't accept Hegel's philosophy of history. He's very critical of this idea, precisely because the metaphysical dimension, the metaphysical reality of a development of the spirit, as Hegel envisions it in the Phenomenology and other writings, is something that he simply cannot accept. But what he does accept is the idea of an essential historicity of humanity, and a historicity which is above all the historicity of reason, and a historicity in which reason in fact progresses, in which it discovers and refines its own basic principles. So I mean, it's idealism, but not in the Hegelian sense. To say about the a priori, I think that's a very important question, a very difficult question in Windelband, because it's much more difficult to understand. But I think that there is an a priori in all forms of concept formation, whether it's in the natural sciences or in the ideographic historical sciences, and you can understand it in this way. If you look at Kant, I'm thinking of the Transcendental Analytic, where Kant asks at one point, what's the difference between a dream and reality? What if in fact we constitute experience according to the forms of space and time that we impose on it, which Windelband will accept, this idea that, in fact, the pure forms of experience are something that we lend to it according to necessary and universal rules. The answer to the question, what distinguishes reality from a dream, is that reality necessarily and universally conforms to certain rules. And those rules are unchanging. Whereas in a dream, there are all sorts of incoherences that violate these principles and let us know that they are not real. Schopenhauer, this is a very important point, because Schopenhauer, in his essay on history, he says that history is the long dream of humanity. So what he's saying essentially is that in its reality, that history is so individual and so composed of ungraspable singular events and facts that you can't make it coherent in its real objective being. So that what Windelband has to do is to rescue a certain notion of the a priori, in other words, of this coherence of judgment, scientific judgment in history, and to accord to it an a priori status, which he does. The answer that he would give to the question is that what distinguishes, why is history not simply the dream of humanity? It's precisely because of this overarching coherence, this cohesion of different historical periods, and this ongoing continuity of rationality, which becomes ever more refined and in a critical perspective over the long course of history, which begins to recognize its ultimate grounding in fundamental principles that become ever more clear. All of this indicates that there is an a priori basis. The cohesion that Kant talks about of universal and necessary principles is given by the overarching rationality of the human world in history. So I think that that's an extremely important point. And this comes out in the theoretical world, precisely in these theoretical relations to values, because the possibility of making objective judgments and saying that, in fact, I'm able to reconstruct what Napoleon, in the period of Napoleon, historical actors in the period thought to be valuable, and what their values were, their singular values in that historical context. This is something that I can understand in its individuality, and that 50 years from now, people will be able to read what I've written about it and say, yes, this is true, because the theoretical relation to values shows a certain cohesion over a period of time where this objectivity does not change. It's an objectivity which is anchored. It may be refined. We may find principles that make it ever deeper and ever better, but the essential insight into these theoretical values that lend objectivity to our historical explanations, these operate according to a priori principles that do not change over time in any essential way.
So, would it be safe to say that Windelband is trying to escape or avoid the consequences of historisms as developed by, above all, Ernst Rauch and Eucken, for instance, by referring to a concept of history which is internal to consciousness?
That's a very important question. And in fact, he's constantly criticizing and resisting in the Preludium. He's constantly resisting and criticizing historicism on that basis. It's very important when you look at the internal development of the Neo-Kantian movement to see that certain authors abandon. Max Weber is the case in point. Max Weber is very much influenced by Windelband and Rickert, especially Rickert. And he refers to him, as soon as he talks about objectivity, his essay on the objectivity of the sciences, immediately invokes the name of Rickert. I mean, this distinction that Rickert makes between theoretical relation to values and practical value judgments is something that Max Weber accepts directly as it is. It inspires his own idea of objectivity, but the essential difference is that he does not accept the idea of some transcendent postulate, this idea of a transcendent anchoring of values. He doesn't. He sees this as being unnecessary to the sciences and not something that is useful for empirical science. And so this is something of an argument between Rickert and Weber. But in general, on the principles of the sciences, they're very close in their theoretical outlook. And Weber is very much influenced by. There's a passage in Rickert's book on Die Grenzen der naturwissenschaftlichen Begriffsbildung, the limits of concept formation in the natural sciences, in which he addresses the problem. He says, what's the difference between Weber's sociology and my conception of history? And we see that sociology admits a greater degree of generality in its formation of types that distinguishes it from the individual concept formation of the historical sciences. So that there's a whole theory of the human sciences, the difference between sociology and history, that Weber very much accepts, that develops out of this. But the basic difference between them lies in their relation to the problem of transcendent values, which is something Weber is not willing to acknowledge.
Oh, thank you very much. I think that Weber would have to stop because, like, being a sociologist, he would have to stop, and that was like the main question between Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch. Troeltsch would be which go like much further in relation to Bewusstsein's theoretische and philosophy and so on. But thank you very much, Professor Barash, for your answer. And now I would like to ask a question to Professor Andrea Poma. I'm aware that Cohen's philosophy of religion has much to do with especially Protestant liberal theologies. He was like an avid reader of Protestant liberal theologies. And yesterday I asked to Professor Olivier the relationship, the status of religion in Cohen's system. And he would refer to the concept of Gefühl, feeling, which was like which is the ground concept for Schleiermacher, for instance, construction of the whole doctrine of theological doctrine or the Glaubenslehre, which is like a special form of modern theological construction. So my question would be like, and a comment as well, would have to do with the status of the religious a priori as espoused by Troeltsch and also by Rudolf Otto, empirical schematism, which became just among other possibilities around the 1900s for justifying religion and its general validity. Against the background of the process of self-differentiation of the system of sciences, Wissenschaftssystem, as a result of the advance of social and cultural modernization in its process of self-differentiation into distinct subsystems, as Niklas Luhmann describes, theology lost its self-claimed position as guardian of the monopoly of the cultivation of the religious field. The old forms of justification have thus lost their plausibility. Theology had to redefine its foundation from its own means, that is to say, from an exercise of interiorization of enlightened criticism as a moment of foundation of a concept of religion capable of responding to the conditions of possibility imposed by the court of reason, which is pretty much the case with Cohen philosophy of religion in this case. So the Neo-Kantianism from the southwest Germany, as espoused by Windelband in his sketch of a philosophy of religion, namely Das Heilige, published in 1902, subtracted religion from the transcendental forms of consciousness, that is, thought, action, and feeling, distinguishing it from these functions of consciousness in its transcendental legality. Windelband relates religion to the self-relationship of consciousness, which is, as such, transcendent. Through the antinomy between the normativity and empirical facticity, which is linked to the realization of the three faculties of consciousness, religious represents the unity of culture, that is, the sacred. For Windelband, religion is as the non-derivative perception of the unity of norm and appearance of consciousness in transcendent life. What is essential is to live beyond experience, the awareness of belonging to a world of spiritual values, not being content with what is empirically real. In turn, the Neo-Kantian Hermann Cohen from Marburg also took the tendency to attribute religion to general consciousness and no longer to a specific a priori consciousness. In his study, Der Begriff der Religion im System der Philosophie, publishing in 1915, Cohen separates religion from the three functions of consciousness in their transcendental legality and attributes them to the individual realization of cultural consciousness. For Cohen, the religious idea of God represents the unit of culture as an idea. So my question is like this whole idea of an idea of culture represented by religion, how would that be like developed within the framework of Cohen's philosophy of religion? Is it like an a priori structure? Is religion an a priori structure of reason? Or is it only an idea? And by only, I mean not only, but also an important and foundational idea for the whole culture, for the unit of the whole culture. What would be then the status of religion in his system of philosophy? And of course, there are many questions regarding your paper as well, in regards to the sacred and the saint, so to say, is to translate to English, because that does not go well with the biblical interpretation of monotheism and so on. So, but that's a different question. But my question is regarding the status of the philosophy of religion, especially of religion, in the construction of the unit or the postulated unit of culture in its totality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Your contribution is so rich of themes that it's for me impossible to discuss all the points, but I will only say something about two themes. The theme of feeling in the relation between religion and philosophy, and the theme of the place of the religion of reason in the system of Cohen. So, as you say, in the Religione insistente della philosophie, there is three parts, and the third part is dedicated to this argument, the relation between religion and aesthetics. I wrote the introduction to this volume of the Cohen works, and when I studied for this, I reflected on a singularity. The part on the relation between religion and logics, and the part of the relation between religion and ethics are very positive. Cohen explained how many relations there are and important relations there are between religion and logics and religion and ethics. But the third part is completely negative. Cohen dedicated this part to say what difference, what no relation there is between religion and aesthetics. Why? Why? So the history is complicated but also interesting. In this time, Cohen was very, very preoccupied and worried for the direction of Nathop's thought, because Schleiermacher was in general a very, very stark influence in the reflection about religion. And Nathop was very deep influenced from Schleiermacher, so that he went more and more away from Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher wrote about the infinity of the feeling of the infinity, and Nathop write about the infinity of feeling. That is about Verstärkung of Schleiermacher. And that was very, very problematic for Cohen. And in this moment, he was more interested to signify the difference between religion and aesthetics, because there was the risk to unify them in the direction of Schleiermacher and Nathop. In the religion of reason, the situation is changed. He has no more this stark worry in front to Nathop. And there is many reflection about the aesthetic dimension of the religion and the feeling dimension of the religion. So this is only a part of the answer. The other thing about the place of the religion in front of the system, many opinions are said. Someone says, this is the Rosenzweig thesis, that with the religion of reason, Cohen changed his philosophy in the direction of an existential philosophy, of the Neues Denken, of other. I think Rosenzweig say from himself, on himself, and not on Cohen. Cohen didn't change his thought in the religion of reason. Someone says that the religion of reason is the fourth and final part of the system. But in my opinion, that this is also wrong. I think it is right what Rosenkreuz says, that in the first time, Cohen talked to the aesthetic as the third and finished part of the system. And this is an important theme in the aesthetic, because it says that the beauty is the realization of the unity of logic and ethics. That is the realization of the system. But what is the limit of this realization? It is the realization in a figure, not in an idea. So he saw that the aesthetic cannot be the complete, the finish of the system. And he thought from the logic as the psychology, as the 40 part and completement of the system. But he didn't wrote this psychology. But I didn't wrote anywhere that religion or reason was a part of the system. Religion or reason is not a part of the system. My opinion, but this is only few words. I should make more reflection. It is not a part of the system, is another perspective on the system, is another perspective on the system. From the uniqueness of God, all the system of logic, ethics, aesthetics, psychology can be shown in another perspective. But it's another thing about, it's not a part of the system. Then you have made many other interesting reflections, but I cannot answer to. We can discuss those mainly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Poma. Thank you very much. So I'll ask to Evandro, if you could state your question, please.
Good afternoon.
Good evening.
Professors and my colleagues. And first of all, I'd like to thank the invitation to take part in this colloquium on Neokantismo. Yeah, like I said before, I'm Franz Brentano's ethical researcher, and for me it's a very interesting opportunity to take part in a conference with Neokantism, but it's interesting. So interesting at all to talk about papers from Professor Andrea Poma, because his paper is, I had the opportunity to read this paper in advance, and it's so interesting for us, especially in Brazil at this moment, political moment, but it's so interesting as well for us, because the purpose of the papers and it's a way to discuss with a lot of anthropological interpretation of religion here in Brazil. Then I would make just a question about the paper and about the principal argument, but I would like only to say 2 or 3 words about our culture and about the conception of religion here in Brazil. Maybe can be interesting for Professor Poma and but maybe it's not new for the others. At first, I would like to point out that here, of course, everybody know it's a country where we speak Portuguese language as a European language, and in this way, we are in the here of the Western. But we have almost 200 languages here in Brazil that are speak by native peoples, and this almost 200 languages preserve their culture and especially their religion. Then we are talking about a country where we can find almost 200 kinds of religion, but maybe it's more, because we can define as like a multicultural country, because we receive our religion from all the world, and Buddhism, agnosticism, like Professor Poma pointed out, and all kind of Christianism, but Judaism, of course. But my point here is that when we think about language and religion, and you take some consideration about hermeneutics, then maybe we have a question to make you have a difficult to accept some solution that can be pointed out in a perspective of universalization. Maybe not, but the fact here in this moment is that we can think about a country where the pluralism, religious pluralism, is the point. In this way, I think that you can understand my question, because I think that your interpretation for Cohen may be lead with this problem. And I think this is the same problem that Professor Dulcio from Mexico think about, and we think about, and you have some theoretical way of think about this problem. The famous solutions we can find in the Theology of Libertation from Professor Dulcio, that think that the point is not give up on universality of the ethical proposal, ethical principle, but in the same time, you need, like your interpretation point out, you need, or Cohen point out, you need recognize the concrete order in the heart of possibility of universalization. Yes, this is in the front a theoretical point. Maybe it's obvious, but when you think about an country like Brazil, or the multiculturalism country, the kind of multicultural country that we have in South America, and this question become more important. And so under this background, I will return to the consideration about some points of your papers, and that for me was very, very interesting, and where I think you try to develop some possible solution. Yeah? And well, it's interest for me in your paper is this this paper explicitly analyze the relation between monotheist and religion, but reanalyze the ethics theory from the universal perspective, and maybe it's possible, or we need to put or start a discussion with the colonial perspective. In this sense, I will try use two quotations from Bonhonet. Bonhonet offered in his book Hermann Cohen, Kantian Philosophy of Religion, two roads to think about the concrete other. It's an interesting quotation. In the first quotation, Bonhonet said that one road to take compassion to others, towards the concrete others, which is complete. A moment, please. One road to take compassion towards the concrete other, which is complementary to an ethic of universal respect as its point of departure, and agrees that an attitude of compassion to recognize of other as a genuine individual presupposes and distinctive religion's conscience. And second, the quotation from Bonhonet, he said, the other road is inspired by Kant, wrestling with the problem of removal of moral guilt in religion, in his in Kant's famous books, Religion is with limits of reason alone, and center around the question to guide the liberation from guilt. Then the problem and the question that I'd like to point out lead me to consider the controversy surrounding the limit of Kant enlightenment ethics, even in light of Hegel's criticism. From the point of the view of the Hegel's criticism, even if the imperative category from Kant had a formal power to impose the moral criterion, the problem was that formalization was empty and cannot, in fact, develop moral in the culture. Well, and when check the anthropology of Kant, we can find a lot of examples that we can today criticize at a no Christian, for example, no Christian, because the out consideration for Kant about people out of Europe in this anthropological book, and it's a split violation of the second formulation of categorical imperative. Well, what I can to do is point out some perspective in Kant's philosophy to understand how possible is to go from Kant to Cohen and find in Cohen a solution, like you develop in your text, but find in Cohen a solution for some limitation of Kant in categorical imperative. Well, in this way, my question is that how far from Kant's ethics can Cohen messianic ethics advance by taking as its starting point compassion toward the concrete other? Or how close or how far is compassion towards the concrete other, not only for the peoples of different cultures and religion, but also for non-human beings, like animals and other beings? And this is my question. How can Cohen offer a solution for the formalism of Kantian ethics, and how this solution can offer space for the concrete others, but thinking concrete others not only like a person, but even like other beings, no human persons, like animals, for example.
Did you finish?
Yes.
Thank you very much. You said about a problem that is for me one of the most important, and it was the theme of my last lesson at the university that will be published in this time. It was exactly the foundation of the pluralism in a Kantian deontological ethics. And that was my thesis, that only an absolutely rigorously deontological ethics can found a real and authentic pluralism. That the opposition, the real opposition, is not, as Mann says, between absolutism and pluralism in the ethics, where absolutism signifies also totalitarianism or imperialism, and pluralism signifies also relativism. That is false. The real opposition is between pluralism and relativism. These are the real opposites. Real relativism is the opposite of pluralism. Why? Because what characterizes the pluralism is the legitimacy of many different positions. The key word is legitimacy. In the relativism, all the positions are possible because never, no one of them are legitimate. There is no legitimate principle. So all is equal because all is not legitimate. But in pluralism, the key word is legitimacy. A pluralistic society or culture is a society or culture that recognizes that many different positions are legitimate, And for this, we need a principle of legitimation. And this principle of legitimation must be an absolute principle, but not a dogmatic and totalitarian principle. An absolute principle, not dogmatic, not totalitarian, signifies a formal principle. A formal principle. As Kant said, the categorical imperative is not the ethic of Kant, it's the foundation of the ethic of Kant. That's different. without this absolute formal foundation, we cannot legitimize the different positions. But you must be convinced that we must think not in the thought of identity. Absolute is not identical. Absolute is not imperialistic identical. We must think in the thought of the differences, where the principle, the original principle, is not the identity, but the differences. In this way of thinking, a formal, an absolute formal principle is necessary to legitimate the different positions in a pluralistic society and culture. And this is my opinion. This is the authentic pluralism, that is the opposite of relativism. And what is the discrimination between a legitimate and unlegitimate position? Humanness, humanität, the humanness. Humanness is not a virtue, is not an ethical category. Human can be also something moral bad, but it's human. We say also in popular scene, we say that's human, and we say for other things this anti-human, this anti-human. Human, that's right, Cohen. Humanness, humanität, is the relation with the other before any judgment. Before any judgment. So humanness is not an ethical category. It's an absolute idea that opens the space for the possibility of pluralistic ethics and give them the direction. Many different ethic ways to live and to be are possible and legitimate, but they must be in the limits of the humanness. The anti-humanness, they are not legitimate. This is the idea of the pluralism, in my opinion. And that's the opposite of relativism. That's a very interesting for me, a very thing. Thank you that you introduced it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Just one more question. In this way, in this concept of humanity that is open, can we think about it's possible to converge a lot of culture where the base is the opposite, the base is the sacred and profane, because we can integrate communities that are using that are based in religion, mythical religion, but in order to think about humanity at all.
Yeah, I think not only that the sacred can enter in this space of the pluralism, but we need it, because the religions of the sacred are the way to trade with the sacred, and the sacred is a reality also in our society, also in our individual life, and we have no other way to trade the sacred as the way that the cultures of the sacred, also the psychoanalysis, for example, learned to trade it. Only we must not mix the cultures of the sacred and the monotheism. And it is for this that in my text, but I repeat it in my in my book on the postmodernism, I suggest that we should no more say that monotheism, Jewish and Christian monotheism, is a religion. It's not a religion. Religion is the religion of the sacred. Monotheism is the tradition of the saint. It's a question of word, but the word perhaps make the situation clearer. Say that monotheism is a religion is to confound the things, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's so clear.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Poma. I think it was wonderful, and we're approaching the end of this talk, I think. I don't know if you, Professor Barash and Professor Poma, has something you want to say to us, and so we're langsam to the end of this talk. So
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very stimulating session. I very much liked Professor Poma's last comments on the difference between pluralism and relativism. It's a very important point. And I hope we'll continue our collaboration. Thank you very much.
I thank you all very much. I'm glad to see a new Professor Barash. I hope we have the possibility to meet us another way. And thank you to all you. And I hope also to be connected with you through Mesa and we can continue our discussion and our common reflection. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
So I have just a few words of thank you for you guys. So there's no doubt that this afternoon was very, very fruitful, I think. The exchange and learning with Professor Barash and Poma was excellent for us. So therefore, I would like to thank you in public for your contribution in our volume and to your contribution in our colloquium. And as Professor Barash said and Professor Poma, I hope sincerely that we continue to share and work together. So thank you very much. For us, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.